think I deserve to be in here for the rest of my life. I did something horrible that is unacceptable, and I realize that, but I don't deserve to die.
Tennessee has not executed a woman in more than 200 years, but on September 30th, 2026, that could change. The woman scheduled to die is Christa Pike. She is the only woman on Tennessee's death row, and the crime that put her there began when she was just 18 years old. In January 1995, Christa Pike, her boyfriend Tatterall Shipp, and another student named Shadala Peterson lured Colleen Slemmer, a 19-year-old Job Corps student, into a wooded area near the University of Tennessee agricultural campus. What happened next was one of the most disturbing murders in Tennessee history. Colleen was beaten. She was stabbed. She was tortured. And according to investigators, Christa Pike later kept a piece of Colleen's skull as a souvenir. A year later, Pike was convicted of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death. Now, more than 3 decades after the crime, Tennessee is preparing to carry out a punishment it has not used against a woman in over 2 centuries. This is the story of the murder of Colleen Slemmer, the trial of Christa Pike, and the execution date that could make Tennessee history. Before we get into it, like and subscribe for more stories like this. In 1995, Christa Pike and Colleen Slemmer were both connected to the Knoxville Job Corps Center. Job Corps was meant to give young people a chance to learn skills, work toward a better future, and build some stability. But between Pike and Slemmer, tension had been growing. Prosecutors said Pike believed Colleen was interested in her boyfriend, Tatterall Shipp. That jealousy became the motive the state would later present in court. Pike, Shipp, and Shadala Peterson planned to get Colleen away from the campus. According to court and news accounts, they made Colleen believe they were going somewhere to make peace. Instead, they led her toward a wooded area near the University of Tennessee agricultural campus. Colleen did not know she was walking into a trap. Once they reached the secluded area, the attack began. Pike and Shipp attacked Colleen. Peterson later became a witness for the state. The details of the murder are extremely difficult. Colleen was beaten and stabbed repeatedly. Reports say the attack lasted for an extended period, and prosecutors described it as torture. During the attack, Colleen was mocked and injured again and again. A pentagram was carved into her body. The violence ended when Colleen was killed. Her body was discovered the next day by workers on the university campus. She was 19 years old. The crime scene shocked investigators. This was not a spontaneous fight that ended quickly. This was a planned attack. A young woman had been lured away, isolated, tortured, and murdered. And within days, suspicion began moving toward Christa Pike and the people who had been with her. Christa Pike was arrested soon after the murder. The case against her grew quickly. One of the most disturbing details investigators focused on was the claim that Pike kept a piece of Colleen Slemmer's skull. That detail became part of the public memory of the case. It made the murder feel even colder because it suggested that after the killing, Pike did not simply run from what had happened. Investigators and prosecutors said she carried away a piece of the victim as a trophy. There were also statements from those involved. Shadala Peterson cooperated with prosecutors. Tatterall Shipp was also charged. And Pike's own behavior after the killing became part of the case against her. The state argued that this was not just murder. It was cruelty. It was torture. And it was carried out with enough planning and brutality to justify the death penalty. In 1996, Christa Pike went on trial. She was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. The jury then had to decide her sentence. At the time of the crime, Pike was 18. That fact has followed the case for decades. She was legally an adult, but her lawyers and supporters would later argue that her age, trauma, mental health, and background should have mattered more when deciding whether she should live or die. The jury sentenced her to death. Daryl Shipp, who was 17 at the time of the crime, did not receive a death sentence. He received life in prison. Shadola Peterson, who cooperated with prosecutors, received a lesser punishment. Christa Pike became one of the youngest women in the United States to be sentenced to death in the modern era. And eventually, she became the only woman on Tennessee's death row.
But the story did not end with the murder conviction. Years later, Pike was involved in another violent incident while in prison. In 2001, while already on death row, Pike attacked another inmate, Patricia Jones. She was later convicted of attempted first-degree murder and received an additional sentence. For the state, this became another reason to argue that Pike remained dangerous. For her lawyers, the focus remained on her age at the time of the original crime, her mental health, and the abuse they say shaped her life long before the murder. But the prison attack made the clemency argument harder, because the state could point to violence not only before death row, but also after it. That second case became another piece in the debate over whether Christa Pike should ever be spared.
Over the years, Pike's lawyers have argued that her death sentence should be changed to life in prison. Their argument is not that Colleen Slemmer was not murdered. Their argument is not that the crime was not horrific. Their argument is that Christa Pike was 18 at the time, and that her background and mental health should be considered before Tennessee carries out an execution. Her attorneys have said she suffered from severe mental illness and a history of abuse. They have argued that she was emotionally and psychologically damaged when she committed the crime. They have also pointed to changing views on young offenders and brain development. The argument is simple but difficult. If society now understands that 18-year-olds are still developing, should an 18-year-old be sentenced to die for a crime committed at that age? The state's answer has been different. The state has focused on the murder of Colleen Slemmer, the planning, the torture, the brutality, the trophy-like skull fragment, the later prison attack, and the jury sentence. To Tennessee, the crime was severe enough that the death sentence should stand. For decades, Christa Pike remained on death row. Then, in 2025, the Tennessee Supreme Court set an execution date, September 30, 2026. That date matters because Tennessee has not executed a woman in more than 200 years. If the execution happens as scheduled, Christa Pike would become the first woman executed in Tennessee since the early 1800s. That turns her case from an old murder case into a historic death penalty case. Because this is no longer just about what happened in the woods in 1995. It is also about what Tennessee is willing to do in 2026. Execute a woman. Execute someone who was 18 at the time of the crime. Execute the only woman currently on the state's death row. And do it after more than 3 decades of appeals, arguments, and public debate. In 2026, Pike's legal team filed another challenge. This time, the focus was Tennessee's execution protocol. According to reporting from the Death Penalty Information Center, Pike filed a lawsuit challenging the state's lethal injection protocol, arguing that it conflicts with her religious beliefs and violates her rights. Tennessee's newer protocol relies on a single drug, pentobarbital. Pike's challenge adds another layer to the case, because the question is no longer only whether she should be executed, it is also how the state plans to execute her. Execution cases often reach this point. After the crime, the conviction, the appeals, and the clemency requests, the final legal battles can shift to the method itself. What drugs will be used? Who can be present? What religious rights does the prisoner have? What can a spiritual advisor do in the execution chamber? Those questions do not erase the crime. but they shape the final hours of the condemned. And for Christa Pike, those questions are now part of the road towards September 30th, 2026.
The Christa Pike case is difficult because every part of it is disturbing. The victim was 19 years old. The motive prosecutors presented was jealousy. The crime was not quick. The violence was prolonged. The murder included torture. And the detail about the skull fragment made the case infamous. But the case is also disturbing for another reason. Pike was 18. She was barely an adult. She has now spent most of her life under a death sentence. Her lawyers say she was deeply damaged before the murder ever happened. Her supporters say life in prison would be a severe enough punishment. But Colleen Slemmer's family has lived for decades with the reality of what was done to her. For them, the case is not about legal theory. It is about Colleen. A young woman who walked into the woods and never came back. A young woman whose final moments were filled with fear and pain. A young woman whose name should not be buried under the history of the woman sentenced to die for killing her.
Christa Pike's scheduled execution forces Tennessee to confront a rare question. Not whether Colleen Slemmer was murdered. Not whether the crime was brutal. Not whether Pike was convicted. Those facts have already been decided in court. The question now is different. Should Tennessee execute a woman for the first time in more than 200 years? Should the state execute someone who was 18 at the time of the crime? Should trauma, mental illness, and youth change the punishment, even when the crime itself was horrific? Or should the final decision rest on what happened to Colleen Slemmer in those woods in 1995? On September 30, 2026, Tennessee may answer that question. If the execution goes forward, Christa Pike will die by lethal injection. And Tennessee will carry out an execution it has not carried out against a woman in more than 2 centuries. But whatever happens, the center of the story remains the same. Colleen Slemmer was 19 years old. She was lured into the woods. She was tortured. She was killed. And for that crime, Christa Pike has spent nearly 3 decades waiting for the state to decide whether she will live the rest of her life in prison or die by execution.